The champagne glass slipped from Margaret's trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the grand ballroom. Just as her world came crashing down around her, she stood frozen in her emerald evening gown, watching as her husband of 23 years knelt before a woman young enough to be their daughter. The crystal chandelier above cast dancing shadows across the stunned faces of 300 wedding guests, all witnessing what would become the most talked-about moment in Manhattan's high society. "Victoria," Richard's voice echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom. "Will you marry me?" Margaret felt her heart stop. This wasn't just any wedding reception. This was their son David's wedding to his college sweetheart, Sarah. Their family's most precious moment, now forever tainted by her husband's public betrayal. But here's what nobody expected, not even Margaret herself. Instead of running away in tears or causing a scene, something extraordinary happened. A strength she never knew she possessed rose from the depths of her being, like a phoenix emerging from ashes. Have you ever experienced that moment when life forces you to discover who you really are? When everything you thought you knew about yourself gets stripped away, and you're left with nothing but raw truth. Margaret walked slowly toward her husband, her heels clicking against the marble with deliberate precision. The crowd held its breath. Victoria, a 28-year-old marketing executive from Richard's company, looked mortified, realizing she had become an unwitting participant in a public humiliation. "Richard," Margaret's voice was steady, surprisingly calm. "Stand up." Her husband rose awkwardly, the diamond ring still clutched in his sweaty palm. His face had gone pale, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what he had just done. "In 23 years of marriage," Margaret continued, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "you have given me many things. A beautiful home, financial security, 2 wonderful children." She paused, looking directly into his eyes. "But you forgot to give me something far more valuable. Respect." The guests remained transfixed. David, their son, stood beside his new bride, his face a mixture of shock and shame. Sarah squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her cheeks, not for the joy of her wedding day, but for the pain she witnessed in her new mother-in-law's eyes. "Victoria," Margaret turned to the younger woman, who was now visibly shaking. "You're not the villain in this story. You're just another victim of a man who believes he can have everything without consequences." What Margaret did next would be remembered for years to come, becoming a story passed down through generations of women who found themselves at crossroads, wondering if they had the courage to choose themselves. She removed her wedding ring, a stunning 5-carat diamond that had once symbolized eternal love and promise. But instead of throwing it dramatically or handing it back to Richard, she did something unexpected. She placed it gently on the gift table next to the other wedding presents. "This belongs to the past," she said simply, "and I choose to live in the future." Then Margaret walked to the microphone that had been set up for the wedding toasts. The band had stopped playing entirely. Even the waitstaff had frozen in place, sensing they were witnessing something historic. "My dear friends and family," Margaret's voice was strong now, filled with a clarity that surprised even herself. "Thank you for being here to celebrate David and Sarah's beautiful beginning. Love is precious, fragile, and deserves to be honored." She looked directly at her son, who was fighting back tears. "David, your father and I may have lost our way, but that doesn't diminish the love that created you and your sister. Sometimes the greatest gift parents can give their children is the courage to choose happiness over comfort, truth over convenience." The room was so quiet you could hear hearts breaking and, simultaneously, healing. "I want to share something with all of you," Margaret continued. "For years, I defined myself by my role as Richard's wife. I forgot that I was Margaret first, a woman with dreams, ambitions, and a voice that deserved to be heard. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped living for others' expectations and started living for your own truth?" Margaret was about to find out. "I'm 52 years old," she announced, a smile beginning to form on her lips. "Some might say it's too late to start over, but I believe it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." Richard stood there, still holding the ring meant for Victoria, looking like a man who had just realized he had gambled away the most valuable thing he'd ever owned. Victoria had quietly slipped away from the scene, understanding that she wanted no part in this public drama. I'm going to do something I should have done years ago, Margaret continued. I'm going to pursue my dreams. I'm going to travel to places I've only read about in books. I'm going to finish the novel I started writing 20 years ago, but put aside because I thought being a good wife meant sacrificing my ambitions. The guests began to murmur, but not in judgment. There was something inspiring about watching a woman reclaim her power, even in the midst of her darkest moment. Most importantly, Margaret's voice grew stronger. I'm going to teach my children, especially my daughter Emma, that self-respect is not negotiable. That love without respect is just pretty packaging around an empty box. David stepped forward then, leaving his bride's side for a moment. Mom, his voice cracked with emotion. I'm so sorry. You deserved so much better than this. Margaret's composure finally broke, but not in the way anyone expected. She laughed, a genuine, liberating laugh that seemed to lift the heavy weight that had settled over the room. Oh, my sweet boy, she said, walking toward him. This is not your fault. This is your father's choice, and now it's become my opportunity. Sometimes life's greatest disasters become our greatest doorways to freedom. She hugged her son tightly, whispering something in his ear that made him nod through his tears. What happened next surprised everyone, including Margaret herself. The guests, instead of awkwardly dispersing, began to applaud. Slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation. Women were crying, men were nodding with respect, and even some of Richard's business associates were looking at him with barely concealed disgust. But the story doesn't end there. What Margaret did in the following months would prove that sometimes our greatest defeats can become our most spectacular victories. Within a week, Margaret had contacted a divorce attorney. Within a month, she had enrolled in a creative writing course at Columbia University. Within 3 months, she had sold the first chapter of her novel to a major publishing house. The novel, titled The Marble Floor, became a bestseller, resonating with thousands of women who saw their own stories reflected in Margaret's journey from betrayal to empowerment. The book deal gave her financial independence, something she had never experienced in her adult life. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this story is what happened to the relationships that truly mattered. David and Emma, initially devastated by their parents' public separation, found themselves developing a deeper, more authentic relationship with their mother. They discovered Margaret's wit, intelligence, and strength that had been overshadowed for years by her role as Richard's accommodating wife. Victoria, the young woman caught in Richard's selfish drama, actually reached out to Margaret months later. She had quit her job at Richard's company and started her own marketing firm. In her letter, she wrote, "Your grace under fire taught me what real strength looks like. I hope someday I can handle adversity with half your dignity." As for Richard, well, he learned that actions have consequences. His reputation in business circles suffered significantly. Many clients began questioning the character of a man who would humiliate his wife so publicly. His company lost several major accounts, and he found himself scrambling to rebuild not just his business, but his relationship with his children, who struggled to respect a father who had shown such callous disregard for their mother. The transformation wasn't immediate, of course. Real change never is. There were nights when Margaret sat in her new apartment, a cozy brownstone she'd purchased with her book advance, wondering if she'd made the right choice. The silence felt deafening after decades of a house filled with the noise of family life. She'd wake up reaching for someone who was no longer there, then remember that she had chosen this solitude as a path to finding herself again. During those quiet moments, Margaret would walk to her writing desk, a beautiful antique piece she'd bought for herself, something Richard would have called impractical. She'd run her fingers over the smooth wood and remember the dreams she'd buried so long ago. Sometimes she'd cry, not for Richard, but for all the years she'd spent believing that being small made others feel bigger, that dimming her light made others shine brighter. The most challenging part wasn't the loneliness or the financial uncertainty. It was learning to trust her own voice again. For so many years, she'd filtered every thought through the question, what would Richard think? Now she had to learn to ask, what do I think? What do I want? What brings me joy? Her daughter Emma became her unexpected ally during this journey. 25 years old and working as a teacher in Boston, Emma had watched her mother's transformation with a mixture of pride and regret. "Mom," she said during one of their weekly phone calls. "I'm ashamed to admit this, but I never really knew who you were. I only knew you as Dad's wife and our mother. Now I'm getting to meet Margaret for the first time, and she's incredible." Those words meant more to Margaret than any review her book would ever receive. The writing process itself became a form of therapy. Each chapter of The Marble Floor forced Margaret to examine different aspects of her life, her choices, her dreams deferred. She wrote about the young woman who had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in English literature, who had dreamed of writing novels that would touch people's hearts. She wrote about the moment she'd set those dreams aside, convincing herself that supporting Richard's career was more important than pursuing her own. She wrote about the subtle ways she'd made herself smaller over the years, how she'd stopped expressing opinions that differed from Richard's, how she declined invitations to book clubs and art classes because Richard preferred her to be available for his business dinners, how she'd gradually stopped seeing friends who challenged her to think differently or dream bigger. But she also wrote about resilience, about the quiet strength that women carry, often without even realizing it. She wrote about the mothers who sacrifice sleep to comfort crying children, the wives who hold families together during crises, the daughters who care for aging parents. She wrote about how these acts of love, while beautiful, can sometimes cost us pieces of ourselves if we're not careful to maintain our own identity in the process. The book struck a chord with readers because Margaret didn't paint herself as a perfect victim or Richard as a complete villain. She wrote with nuance, acknowledging her own role in allowing the erosion of her identity. She wrote about the comfort of familiar patterns, even when those patterns weren't serving her growth. She wrote about how easy it is to mistake being needed for being valued, being accommodating for being loved. 3 months after the book's publication, Margaret received a letter that changed everything. It was from a 60-year-old woman named Catherine in Portland, Oregon. Catherine wrote, "I read your book and realized I've been living your story for 35 years. Yesterday, I enrolled in graduate school to become a therapist. I'm terrified and exhilarated. Thank you for showing me it's not too late to become who I was meant to be." That letter was followed by hundreds of others. Women writing about leaving unfulfilling marriages, starting businesses, going back to school, pursuing art, traveling alone for the first time, setting boundaries with grown children who had never learned to see them as individuals rather than just mom. Margaret's story had given them permission to choose themselves. But this story isn't really about Richard's downfall. It's about Margaret's rise and the ripple effect of one woman's courage to honor her own worth. 2 years after that devastating night, Margaret was invited to speak at a women's empowerment conference. She stood before an audience of 500 women, many of them facing their own crossroads, their own moments of truth. That night, she told them, "When my world shattered like that champagne glass, I thought my life was ending. I didn't realize it was finally beginning." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, seeing her younger self in many of them. How many of you have been waiting for permission to live your own life? How many of you have been so busy being what others needed that you forgot what you wanted? The audience was silent, but Margaret could feel the recognition, the shared understanding of women who had given pieces of themselves away until they weren't sure what was left. "I want to tell you something," Margaret continued, her voice filled with the wisdom that only comes from walking through fire and emerging stronger. "You don't need anyone's permission to choose yourself. You don't need a crisis to give you courage. You don't need to wait until you're pushed to the edge to discover your own strength." She smiled, thinking of that night in the ballroom, how terrifying and liberating it had been. But if life does push you to that edge, if you find yourself standing where I stood that night with your heart breaking and your dignity being trampled, remember this. You have a choice. You can let the betrayal define you, or you can let your response to it transform you. Margaret's story spread far beyond that conference. It became a testament to the power of choosing grace over bitterness, growth over victimhood, and self-respect over staying in situations that diminish our worth. The most beautiful irony of all? Richard's public proposal to Victoria, meant to humiliate Margaret, instead became the catalyst for her greatest triumph. The moment intended to break her actually freed her, but perhaps the most profound transformation came in Margaret's relationship with herself. She began to understand that the woman who had stood in that ballroom, gracefully handling the most humiliating moment of her life, had always existed within her. The strength hadn't appeared suddenly that night. It had been there all along, waiting for a moment when it was desperately needed. She started recognizing this strength in other areas of her life that she'd previously taken for granted. The way she'd managed the household finances when Richard was too busy with work. The way she'd navigated difficult conversations with teachers when David was struggling in school. The way she'd cared for her mother during her final illness, maintaining grace and patience even when she was exhausted. The way she'd built friendships that lasted decades, being the person others called during their own crises. Margaret realized that she'd been strong all along. She'd just been taught to call that strength, supporting others, rather than recognizing it as personal power. This revelation led to another chapter in her journey. She began volunteering at a women's shelter, helping women who were rebuilding their lives after leaving abusive relationships. Margaret found that her story of transformation, while different in circumstances, shared common threads with theirs. The fear of starting over, the challenge of rebuilding identity, the courage required to choose uncertainty over familiar unhappiness. One evening at the shelter, a young mother named Jennifer, barely 25 with 2 small children, sat across from Margaret during a support group meeting. "Mrs. Warren," Jennifer said, "I keep thinking I'm too young to start over, that I should try to make it work. But when I read your story, I realized maybe I'm not too young. Maybe I'm exactly the right age to save myself." Margaret felt tears well up in her eyes. "Jennifer," she said softly, "you're not starting over. You're starting. Period. And that's the most beautiful thing anyone can do at any age." These conversations at the shelter taught Margaret something profound about resilience. She learned that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about how we choose to get back up. It's about recognizing that our wounds can become our wisdom, our setbacks can become our comebacks, and our struggles can become our stories of triumph. She also learned that healing isn't a destination. It's a journey. There were still days when Margaret felt angry about the years she'd lost, the dreams she'd deferred, the parts of herself she'd buried. But she'd learned to hold space for those feelings without letting them define her future. She'd learned the difference between processing pain and dwelling in it. The writing of her second book began during this phase of her journey. Titled Rising from the Ruins, it focused not just on her own transformation, but on the stories of women she'd met through her speaking engagements and volunteer work. Women who had found the courage to leave careers that drained their souls, marriages that diminished their worth, or patterns of behavior that kept them small. Each story reinforced the same message. It's never too late to choose yourself, and it's never too early either. Age becomes irrelevant when we're talking about honoring our authentic selves. Now, whenever Margaret walks into a room, she carries herself with a confidence that comes from knowing she survived her worst nightmare and emerged more authentic, more powerful, and more alive than she had ever been. But more than that, she carries the knowledge that her story has become a bridge for others to cross from their own defeats to their own victories. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most devastating moments in our lives are actually invitations to step into our true power. Sometimes what looks like an ending is really a beginning in disguise. So here's my question for you. What would you do if life suddenly stripped away everything you thought defined you? Would you have the courage to rebuild yourself from the ground up? Would you choose to see betrayal as a tragedy or as a liberation? Margaret's story proves that it's never too late to choose yourself, to honor your worth, and to discover that your greatest strength often lies dormant until the moment you need it most. What moment in your life called you to discover who you really are? What would you do differently if you knew that your response to life's challenges could inspire others to find their own courage? Share your thoughts, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we all have the strength to rise from our own marble floors.